Thank you very much. I felt my life flashing before me there, as everything was described. So I'm not going to talk about all that, because I only have half an hour. And instead, I'm going to try to do something, you should never rest on your laurels, my mother used to say. You never rest on your past successes. You always move forward, So receive this in the spirit of always moving forward. So why would you have to move forward? Well, you could do it for the sake of it, but I think this is going to be research that Daron and I are doing at the moment. I think, the reason we're so compelled to move forward is we feel we have an incomplete way of understanding what's going on in the world today. I'm probably not the only person in this room who thinks they have an incomplete understanding of what's going on in the world today. So here's how we're trying to think about this. So I think Professor Fair gave me this title actually, but it was a good title, and I hope I've risen to the challenge. But again, this is very much in the spirit of brainstorming and, how do we think about what's going on? And of course, it is going to be related to many of these topics that will be discussed. Okay, so let's, what undermines democracy? Let me just remind you that democracy is being undermined. And I'm going to show you two pictures. The one on the left comes from my former colleague at Harvard, actually, Samuel Huntington. So Sam wrote this very famous book on the waves of democracy and showed how, if you look historically, democracy tends to go in waves. Countries democratize together, and then often there's a reverse wave, and democracy recedes, and maybe there's coups d'etats, and then the first wave was before the First World War in Western Europe, Latin America. There was a reverse wave in the 20s and 30s. After the Second World War, there was another wave. Then there was a reverse wave, many military coups, especially in Latin America. Democracy in post-independence Africa was overthrown. Then the 1990s, there was another wave of democracy, and now in some sense we're experiencing a reverse wave. And the figures on the right, I'm not going to go into the data in detail, are from the what's called the VDEM project, which is a big project on measuring many different aspects of political institutions in the world. And the fact that those lines are going down means the world is becoming less democratic on average. So that's not clear from Huntington's graph, of course, because that was, he wrote this book 30 years ago. I just wanted to sort of get you to think about the historical picture. But there really is a wave of democracy. Okay, so how would you think about that? What's causing that? Okay, and I think, the way we're trying to understand this is, look at these cases, that are undergoing kind of democratic reversals. The Philippines, Brazil, Hungary, the United States, possibly, according to some people. Okay, so what on earth do all these countries have in common? What does the Philippines have in common with Hungary or Brazil? So I think when you think about economics, and a lot of our work has been about the economic determinants of democracy and the economic kind of determinants of political institutions, it's not obvious to us. Of course, these places are connected by international trade and capital flows, but the Philippines and Brazil, and so it could be. But I think the argument I'm going to make, and I'm not going to have time to go into the evidence that we find compelling in great detail, so you'll just have to kind of go with the flow. And remember, I'm a Nobel Prize winner, so anything I say must be right. What we're going to argue is that what seems to be really correlated across these countries, and I think this is true actually in these historical waves of democracy, is the sort of the idea of democracy as being the kind of legitimate or best way of organizing authority in society. Okay? And I think what I'm going to try to persuade you of, and this is something which has been missing in our research, we've been talking about it for many years without really knowing how to approach it, is when thinking about institutions and institutional equilibria, when thinking about, why is a society democracy, you need to think about, what I'm going to call the normative justifications of democracy, meaning the ideological, I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative sense. You could say ideational foundation of democracy. Why do we have democracy? What do we think about democracy? Is democracy the right way to organize authority, or are there alternative ways of organizing authority? And I don't mean just because of the consequences. We've done a lot of research on the impact of democracy on economic development, on public good provision. Democracy is good for all of that, okay? But it's also, we like democracy for different reasons, and maybe we dislike it for other reasons too, okay? So I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call the ideational foundations of democracy. I'm going to present a way of thinking about that, of sort of structuring what we see, okay? So just to anticipate, where I'm going to head with this, why this? Well, because, for me, to understand what's going on in the United States at the moment, it's actually not about economics. It's mostly about ideas and ideology from my perspective. Okay, so of course you could say, I don't want to talk about the literature too much, but I would say, every social scientist in this room knows that social science has done a pretty awful job of dealing with ideas, meaning, most social science theory is extremely materialist. So, people care about material payoffs, they care about income, they care about wealth. And when you study the kind of political equilibrium in society, you focus on power, resources, wealth, economic payoffs, okay? So most frameworks are like that. Marxist, neoclassical economics, most of my work in political economy too has been remorselessly materialistic. There's other alternatives. There's work in sort of cultural evolution that thinks of ideas, that can kind of incorporate ideas. But that appeals to notions of evolution and sort of there's random ideas pop up. Somebody has an idea, and then it gets traction and spreads if it affects people's payoffs or people benefit from it. And so that's one way of thinking about ideas and how ideas spread. But I think the reason that we're going to resist going down that road is that, and you'll see when I get into this, is that we think agency is very important here. Human agency in creating ideas and creating intellectual frameworks and creating justifications for social arrangements is extremely important. And just thinking of this as some kind of evolutionary process is going to really miss that argument. So here's something very much in the spirit of the economics department at the University of Zurich, right? We need a blending of political economy, we need social psychology, and we need philosophy to understand this. Okay, I like very much the introduction talking about what's the DNA of the economics department of Zurich. I think this is very much in the spirit of the DNA as I understand it. Okay, so let me give you a little sense of the sort of theory, and I'm going to give you lots of examples. Okay, so what's an example of like a normative justification for a particular arrangement? Okay, so let me give you an example. So imagine I became president of the University of Chicago. Okay, and I started hiring all my relatives. You'd think, no, that's nepotism. That's cronyism. Okay, that's inappropriate. Okay, now you could have a view about how that makes the University of Chicago less efficient or whatever it is, but before you even got to that, you'd think, no, that's inappropriate. Okay, now, I'm not going to get too much into cross-cultural work, but I've been working for 15 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I can tell you in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's also a normative order there, but it's completely the opposite of what I just described. Meaning, if I became the president of the University of Kinshasa, the normative order says, I have to use that authority to help my family, to help my social network. And if I don't do it, then I'm violating the social contract, okay? So these, just to give you a sense that these normative orders are not the same in every part of the world. And we think these normative orders, if you start thinking about it, are actually crucial for understanding institutional equilibria, okay? Now, of course, these are intertwined with material payoffs. Right? If I became the president of the University of Chicago, I might want to hire all my relatives because they get a salary and they get a job. So there's material payoffs. Okay? But let me downplay this in the talk because we sort of understand that in economics. Let me emphasize the ideational part of this. Okay? So we want to think of ideas as coming in a way which is maybe related to material interests, but can be autonomous from them. You know, in the time of the French Revolution, for example, if you read about the history of the French Revolution was led by a bunch of aristocrats who had absolutely no material interest in pushing the French Revolution, but they did it anyway. Why? Because they were convinced that this was going to be good for France and that this was a just and legitimate way of organizing society, okay? So, you know, here's the storming of the Bastille. Jonathan Israel, kind of one of the, he's not French, you know, so, but he's one of the let me say, probably the leading US-based political scholar of the French Revolution. You know, here's his interpretation of what drove the French Revolution. Obviously, the causes of the French Revolution are numerous. The causes of what's going on now are numerous. But at the end of the day, the big factor is what he calls the radical Enlightenment. Meaning, you know, it was the ideas of Rousseau that gave people an interpretation of the problem with the ancient regime and a solution, okay? And that was operating at the level of ideas, not material interests, although obviously the revolution affected many material aspects. Okay, so we're going to use a sort of, I'm going to introduce a language, if it's not too clunky, to talk about, you know, these views of society, like I talked about, you know, nepotism, or like what happens, how would you think about me employing all my relatives? We're going to call them schemas. Okay, so a schema is just, it's a way of thinking about the world and a way of understanding the world, justifying, maybe understanding what things mean, maybe justifying why things are organized the way they are, okay? So for example, you know, if I told you that your boss earned 10 times more than you could say, if you're an economist, well, that's because they're 10 times more productive than me. That would be a way of interpreting it. You know, but you could go out at lunchtime and read the Communist Manifesto, and you come back in the afternoon and say, no, that's nonsense, I'm being exploited, okay? That's what it means, okay? So the same fact could mean different things depending on the schema in some sense, how you interpret it, how you relate it to other aspects of society. But of course, there's many schemas in any situation, okay? I just gave you two interpretations of the same fact. You know, there's multiple schemas at play at any one time in society, and there's multiple schemas at any time in your head, you know. So, for example, in Congo, you know, I have a very good friend, the former Minister of Finance, who explained the normative order to me, and he knows how Americans think about this in Congo. He knows how the Congolese think. He knows how the Americans think. That's, you know, and so those things are in contradiction. They're in contradiction in society. They're in contradiction in his head, okay? So there's lots of schemas. And I'm going to zoom in on two, which I'm going to call egalitarianism and hierarchy, okay? So meaning the world could be organized on egalitarian lines, maybe in the economic sphere, maybe in the social sphere, maybe in the political sphere, or it can be organized in hierarchical lines, like patriarchy, you know, or monarchy, or etc. Feudalism, feudal agriculture. Okay, so we could talk about many schemas. You're going to see when I get into this why we're focusing on these two schemas, why we're focusing on a kind of contest in society between kind of egalitarian interpretations of things and justifications and hierarchical interpretations of things. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and let me just jump straight into this schema. Okay, so let me give you another schema talking about, which is a sort of prelude to talking about hierarchy, which I like a lot. And I want to use this to emphasize another point here. So this is King Charles I. Now, King Charles I, King of England in the 17th century, you know, he thought that he was king because God had made him king. All right, he believed in the divine right of kings. Okay, now, one point I want to make here is, you know, in Marxism, for example, people talk about ideas, but ideas are a sort of cover for material interests, okay? I don't want you to think about it like that. That obviously is true in some cases. I want you to think about people genuinely believing things. Now, Charles I, as far as we know, genuinely believed that God had made him king. Okay, what's the evidence for that? Well, there's a lot of evidence, but let me just give you a little bit. He believed he could cure people by touching them. all right? And he believed that so much that, according to one history book, he did this 92,000 times, okay? So that's a lot of touching. Now, you might think, wasn't he afraid that he'd catch something terrible by touching sick people? No, it's in the Bible, okay? He would quote Mark 16:18, all right? He's okay, he's good. God is protecting him, okay? Now, you could say many people believe that in the 17th century, and that's true. But I want to get this point across. He genuinely believed this, okay? It's not some, okay, that's the point. All right, so the Divine Right of Kings. The Divine Right of Kings, the most famous book on the divine right, the most famous philosophical justification for the Divine Right of Kings in England in the 17th century had the title Patriarchy. So it starts with patriarchy in the family. It makes an analogy between the family, starting with the Garden of Eden, of course, and Adam and Eve made from Adam's rib, and hierarchy, justifying hierarchy within the family, hierarchy in social relations, hierarchy in the economy, hierarchy in the polity. Okay, so this is a very clear example of a kind of hierarchical schema in some sense, justifying a particular political system, okay? We can contrast that with egalitarianism, okay? And the way that we're trying to think about that, in some sense, has evolutionary roots, okay? And this is the sort of the justification for focusing on egalitarianism and hierarchy, although you might have sensed the relationship with the political problems we have at the moment. Okay, so here's a puzzle, that primatologists and evolutionary theorists are very interested in, which is, for everything we know about ancestral, or we can guess about ancestral human society, it was extremely egalitarian. But look at our closest primate relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas. They're extremely hierarchical. So how do we go from these very hierarchical primates to being very egalitarian? Okay, of course, hierarchy is good. If you're on top, it generates benefits for the alpha male or the silverback. And it comes along with justifications too. I don't know if Charles I was an alpha male, but I want to say hierarchy isn't just about power relations and one chimpanzee being bigger than the other. It comes along with justifications too. The survival of the fittest. The great example that's being debated in US academia at the moment, of course, is the notion of meritocracy. Is meritocracy just basically an ideology justifying inequality? And meritocracy, comes along not just with, people at the top, people getting high salaries are there because they work so hard, they're so talented, but people at the bottom are there because they didn't work hard and they're not talented, so they don't deserve redistribution. So it comes along with a whole normative justification for the social order and the inequality. It's not just about inequality and equilibrium as a fact, it's also about the justification for the inequality. Okay? And I think the meritocracy example is sort of interesting, because it sort of illustrates a little how this hierarchy works and how normative justifications for hierarchy work. And I always like to illustrate that with this data from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, his beautiful book, Distinction. Okay, so distinction, there's a kind of wordplay there. Distinct, we're different, but I'm distinct, I'm better. So here's the exercise. So Bourdieu was very convinced that hierarchy and inequality shows up everywhere in culture. Okay, so here's let me just give you this one example which I find so kind of devastating. So let's take two pieces of music. The Blue Danube, remember Blue Danube, da 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 da, terribly corny piece of music. Ugh. And the Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, beautiful, sends you into raptures. Okay, now let's divide French society into different categories, different classes. Manual workers, domestic servants at the top, and higher education teachers and art producers, people like me at the bottom. Okay, now play me the Blue Danube. Blech. Okay, 0. Nobody says the Blue Danube is a nice piece of music, okay, if you're a university teacher. What do we like? We like the Well-Tempered Clavier. What about manual workers? The Blue Danube, da, 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 da. We love it. Okay, 50% people, fabulous. What about college professors? Blech. Okay, now here's the thing that Bourdieu points out. It's not just that kind of hierarchy, an economic hierarchy manifests itself in tastes for music and culture, and there's lots of other examples in the book. But working class people recognize that the well-tempered clavier is a better piece of music. But nevertheless, they still like the Blue Danube. So they kind of recognize the inferiority of their tastes. And this, Bourdieu says, this is how hierarchy works. Okay? So this is maybe too much into the weeds, but I love this example. Okay, but what about egalitarianism? Okay, so you have an alpha male. Alpha males have justification. They have Bourdieu. They have Strauss, and everything else on their side. The Blue Danube on their side. What about the people who are outside there suffering? What about the non-alpha males? Well, the non-alpha males can gang up against the alpha male. So this is a hypothesis that Darwin actually advanced in the 19th century. Darwin called it the execution hypothesis, which is non-alpha males try to gang up in what we're going to call a reverse dominance coalition to pull the alpha male down off its pedestal. Okay? And that's what egalitarianism is about. In our view, you can think of egalitarianism as a way of justifying that. Here's my attempt. I'm just a lowly economist and political scientist, but here's my attempt to look erudite, by talking about Greek mythology. Great example of the reverse dominance coalition. Here's Kronos. This is Goya's black paintings. Kronos devouring his children. The story, Gaia, the Earth Mother, prophesied that Kronos, he was a sort of alpha male, would be overthrown by one of his children, so he ate them. Didn't work out completely. And in the end, they ganged up against him. Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus ganged up and killed Kronos, chucked him into Tartarus. Okay, that's the reverse dominance coalition. You gang up against the alpha male and you pull them down. Now, Darwin pointed out, that this has a beautiful kind of evolutionary property because it leads to selection against alpha male genes. If you're an alpha male and you start pushing everybody around and they gang up and they kill you, then alpha males don't get to reproduce and there's selection against alpha male genes. So there's hierarchy that's kind of natural. It generates material payoffs. It can be justified. That's but there's egalitarianism fighting against that, And, Darwin's idea was that, the reason that Homo sapiens is like it is exactly because of this execution hypothesis and because of the success of these reverse dominance coalitions, okay? So we like reverse dominance coalition, and in some sense, the way we're thinking about egalitarian schema or ideas, from each, according to his ability, to each according to his needs, okay? So there's an egalitarian idea, okay? These ideas are important for saying, this alpha male, it's really unfair, normative schemas are very important for generating collective action, for fighting against hierarchy, okay? So I want to say, of course, there's power here, but the ideas are very important in justifying different arrangements and justifying challenges. There are these different schemas. The schemas are fighting. You need ideas to beat an idea, I think Paul Samuelson famously said. Okay, you need a theory to beat a theory. Now, I want to talk about the institutionalization of these different power structures, if you like. There's many ways in society you can institutionalize these things. Here's the Maasai people of East Africa. Maasai society, not institutionalized the way Western society is. When you're young boys and girls, this is just the boys, young boys they're initiated into an age set. Okay, so boys of a cohort are initiated into an age set. The age set works together throughout life. The whole society is governed by this succession of age sets. You go through different tasks, different occupations as you go through life, but you can think of a Maasai age set in some sense as an institutionalization. It's a way of bringing people and cementing these relationships together and facilitating collective action. So if the elders get too out of control, the young people are it's very easy to organize against them. I kind of alluded to the fact that, this egalitarianism is going to come along with lots of ideas, a contractarian perspective. Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, when he came up with this idea of we need a Leviathan, to solve the problems of society, he had to come up with a contractarian justification for that. People came together in a covenant and they willingly created this dictator. Okay, so he had to give an egalitarian justification for that autocratic power to set against, no, God created the king. Okay, so we could talk about lots of different ideas here, ideological justifications, what I'm calling schema to justify different political institutions, to justify kind of egalitarian organization of society. And I want to think of democracy, or we want to think of democracy in some sense as one of these institutionalizations of this reverse dominance coalition. Okay, so there's ideas, there's power structures, but ideas can facilitate collective action. They can facilitate, overthrowing hierarchy and creating a more egalitarian society. But it's hard to sustain. You need to sustain these things. So democracy, modern democracy, we think of modern democracy and the institutions of modern democracy as one way of institutionalizing egalitarianism, and it's one way of institutionalizing people's ability to act collectively against hierarchy. Okay? So I think it's a brilliant invention, modern democracy. Massey age sets, it's great, but it's very hard to scale up, to the level of a large society, the way we've managed to scale up modern liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is it's much more flexible than Athenian democracy. You don't have to show up, on the Pnyx or whatever the hill was called and take part. No, you delegate. It's very flexible. You can change the institutions. You can have different electoral institutions, different constitutions adapted to different circumstances. So it's been an enormous triumph of the modern world, but the thing I'm pushing here is to say hierarchy never goes away, hierarchy never goes away in society. There's always wannabe alpha males. I'm not talking too much about the evolutionary foundations here, but in the evolutionary model, there's selection against alpha male genes, but that's not completely successful. Okay, you get a balance, what we call a mix. There's a kind of mixed evolutionary equilibrium. Okay, so that means there's always a competition between hierarchy and egalitarianism. And there's always ways of justifying hierarchy, just as there's always ways of justifying egalitarianism. Okay, and I think that's something we've forgotten a little bit in this kind of cloud cuckoo land that followed the end of history after 1990. My mother, who lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War in Britain, always used to tell me when I was growing up, you have no idea what the world is like. I grew up in 1970s England. She'd say, you have no idea what the world is like. You have no idea. Okay, so what's the theory of social change here? The theory of social change is, earlier I may have had Hegel somewhere, but it's a very Hegelian idea of this. There's a sort of dialectic, there's contest between egalitarianism and hierarchy. There's what you could call cultural struggles. And that's how we're thinking about these waves of democracy. In some sense, democracy goes into reverse. What Sam Huntington called reverse waves are triggered by ideational dynamics. Okay, that can be facilitated by economic crises. If we were going to talk about the rise of National Socialism in the 1930s in Italy or Germany or whatever, we talk about the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, but we don't think that's the only potential driver, okay? So I said a little bit about that, and what I want to say now is how do you apply these ideas to what's going on now? I think, you can point to inequality. You can point to declining wages of workers in the United States who don't have a college education. But for us, the biggest problem is is a kind of ideational clash. It's a clash of ideologies. That what's going on in the United States now is an enormous backlash against this liberal project, which is an ideational project. And it's been going on for a long time, by the way. This is 1976. This is Saul Steinberg's view of the world. It's the view from Ninth Avenue. Okay, so I think this, sometimes a picture tells more than a million words or regressions or equations, no? And here's Ninth Avenue, fantastic, successful, glamorous skyscrapers, and the rest of the world, Chicago just more or less gets on there. I was pretty excited about that. But the rest of the world is this kind of flat, it's the flyover country, what they call the flyover country. So this represents an enormous breach, in US society. And of course that has an economic dimension to it, but it's also cultural and ideological, I think. And, so the view I'm trying to get across here, actually, this is the biggest kind of issue here. And you see it in many different ways, this whole issue of like global elites, like what the British journalist David Goodhart calls the people from somewhere. The people from anywhere, that's me, Like last week I was in Brazil, the weekend, now I'm in Switzerland, yesterday I was in Italy, I was in Korea, I'm from anywhere. And the people from somewhere, the people who are somewhere tied to their community, So that's one manifestation of this, So yes, there's economic inequality, but what I find striking in the United States is that there's no discussion about economic inequality. There's no policy to reduce inequality. Nobody's talking about economic inequality. But what they are talking about is all these ideological issues. And I think, here's the kind of sort of optimistic interpretation of what's happening at the moment in the United States, is that in some sense, this is a democratic backlash against all of these discontents in society, against liberalism, against, this, I was talking about meritocracy and this idea that there's kind of winners and losers, and the losers, deserve to lose, and there's, there's the liberal social engineering project, whether it be vaccinations or whether it be, political correctness in academia or other spheres of society. There's social liberalism, of course, and that has generated this reaction, this ideational reaction against the sort of liberal democracy, okay? So I want to think about that as, it's a normative crisis of democracy, because democracy is not fulfilling, for many people, the ends that it's supposed to, okay? So let me finish with this last slide to just say, how do we think about, what should we do, okay? Well, if you believe this, the most crucial thing is it's about ideas. It's about trying to give people a different sense of democracy and a different sense of what democracy could achieve or is achieving, or why you value it, okay? I think you could say it's a sort of puzzle, and it's not clear that this current moment coalesces into a hierarchical society, or a more hierarchical society. You could say that US society is already extremely hierarchical in many ways, economically, socially. It's already happened. It's not manifested in the political system, So that could happen, I think, and I guess this idea of this contest, but I think it's not inevitable that it will happen. Think about many European countries in the 1930s, in the Depression, with the collapse of democracy in many countries. Sweden invented social democracy, or Norway invented social democracy. They kind of rebooted the reverse dominance coalition. They rebooted democracy with a new social contract. So I think that's the kind of one way of thinking about it. And I don't think there's any reason why all of this discontent in the United States can't be harnessed into that project. I don't see that project yet, but I don't think there's any logical reason why that project couldn't happen. In some sense, it did happen in the 1930s in the New Deal, okay? But there's many other projects on the table too, much more hierarchical projects. But again, for me, social democracy, what was social democracy? Social democracy was an idea. Of course, there was an income distribution model and stuff like that, but it was about getting business leaders and trade unionists and agrarian interests to buy into this social contract, basically. And that took a normative justification, that took ideas. It wasn't just about income distribution. Okay, so I think that's the most important conclusion from this discussion. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay.